Latin word virtus, from which the English term virtue comes from, denotes and connotes strength and worth. Allow me to share with you how I found inner strength and self-worth as a Filipino theologian in a post-colonial situation. We have a saying in the Philippines that goes, "Those who do not know how to look back at where they have come from will never reach their destination." My theological education has mostly been Western in orientation and content, because of our having been colonized by the Spaniards and the Americans for about 400 years, described by some as 350 years in a convent and 50 years in Hollywood. I assumed that thinking like a European or an American theologian was like reaching a truly high level of thought. Intellectually, it is possible to distance oneself from this statement, but it may be different on the affective level. With some exceptions, a few of which were significant, I was taught how to regard as my own the concerns of theologians in the West and to think their thoughts. Well, this mainly happened in an explicit manner through the courses I took when I began my theological training. Up till my advanced studies in the discipline, I got acquainted and habituated with the methods utilized by Western theologians as well as with theological questions and answers that preoccupied them. I consulted resources written by well-known and not so well-known Western theologians and studied ideas, at times adapting them to the Filipino setting. Constantly then, my mind was grappling with Western theological concepts and interests. After all, theology in the West, without any qualifier before the word, was the theology. At times, however, I think the process was more subtle, a realization that comes from hindsight rather than foresight. It is only after years of struggling to deliberately think as a Filipino that I have come to realize how gradually and successfully I had been made to think theologically as a Westerner. Little did I realize the controlling power of the English language on my thoughts, and through those thoughts on my feelings towards the culture. I remember that a friend anthropologist defined culture as shared gut feeling, having a feel before you are able to intellectually articulate it. Over the years of teaching and doing research, it has become clear to me how these have contributed in a subtle way to the stigmatization of the Filipino culture as inferior, no good, or worse, the work of the devil. Thus, it is understandable how everyday grappling with Western theology in the English language led to the embedded erosion of confidence and pride over our very own culture. This colonized mentality, gradually but surely taking shape over the span of 4 centuries, became, to use the words of Indian Ashish Nandi, an enemy within. It was firmly lodged within our consciousness, and our negative feelings with regard to our culture tended to follow suit. Perhaps I am not as lucky as those who feel that the effects of colonization are now over and are convinced that in a post-colonial era we must move on by letting the sands of time cover the pain and difficulties it brought. But I merely narrate my own experience as someone who has been handicapped with and by Western theology and theologizing, although I must admit that I have also learned much from it. What I express only personally, although I am aware that what is most personal and thought to be applicable only to the individual perhaps resonates with others. I recognized English as one of the widely used languages in international exchange, but it cannot and should not function as a hindrance to indigenous thoughts. We Asians professionally theologize in English, the language most of us think, read, and pray, says Sri Lankan theologian Aloysius Pieris. The theological role of language in a continent of languages has been grossly underestimated. Refusing, among others, to be familiar with one's own cultural heritage, continues Pieris, will remain one major obstacle to the discovery of a truly Asian theology. This does not mean doing away with Western theology, but it does mean the attitude contained in the words of Mahatma Gandhi. I do not want my house to be walled in on all sides, and my windows to be stuffed. I want the cultures of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any. Having been conditioned to think in Western theological categories, it was not easy to move out of them. This is where I felt the lingering yet persistent effect of the past colonizations on the psyche. The strain and the struggle to give voice to a Filipino interpretation of the Christian message via the Filipino language has proven to be very challenging. Thus, the attempts I had earlier made to convey these concepts were confined to more or less literal translations of the Western interpretation, albeit more contemporary. Maybe I was speaking and writing in Filipino, but I was thinking in English. Relativizing the inherited cultural expressions of the faith to their own contexts, which had strongly conditioned my own thinking, was more difficult than I thought. It was only when I concretely attempted to reinterpret what kind of God do Christians believe in that I realized that culture could be a guide I could follow with benefit, if I allowed it. The reason was this: using the Filipino language instead of English in attending to Filipino concerns, utilizing cultural presuppositions and following cultural thought structures, utilizing available cultural vocabulary and taking advantage of the local cultural concepts to respond to particular issues in the Philippines. I felt, meaning I experienced deeply, the strength and worth of my very own culture and language. Their wisdom and genius became apparent experientially. I knew that I had learned how to look back at where I had come from and how to set my sight towards my destination. I am home.